Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, I'm showing you 3 movies I watched this weekend. I was sitting around watching movies and I thought I could talk about these on the channel, and indeed I am. They're not movies I specifically watch for the channel. They're movies that I was sitting around and I looked around the shelves here, which took a while because there were a lot of shelves, and I thought, I want to rewatch that. And so I put the movies aside, and about 24 months later, I'm rewatching them. They're very different, 3 different genres, 3 different time periods, kind of, sort of, and they're incredibly different movies. You know that from the thumbnail, so I better get started. We'll start off with a movie which is rated R, which is an adult film without being squishy. It's R-rated for sexual references and nudity, so you know it's going to be fun. Jess Franco's masterpiece of erotic cinema, it says here on the Umbrella edition, Vampyros Lesbos. Now, if you know who Jess Franco was, and you've seen a Jess Franco movie, you know what you're in store for in this one. And it does not disappoint. Strangely enough, this one actually is all region, so that's a little bit rare to have the all region thing on it. But this is an older release of Umbrellas. I know either Severin or one of those companies in the US have released a copy of this. It's a 1970 Jess Franco movie. Now, Jess Franco had been making movies as a director for at least a decade before this film came out. In fact, he even made wholesome musicals in Spanish in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, he phased into horror, and then as censorship classifications and censorship rules reduced in the 60s and 70s, he decided that he wanted to make movies with a lot of naked women in them. And if you're making movies in the 1960s and 1970s, why the hell not?
Busty substances.
Vampyros Lesbos is about a vampire played by Soledad Miranda, an actress whose career was cut short in the early 1970s when she was in a car accident and her racing car driver husband was driving. He turned out not to be hurt, but she died. And so she, who was the muse of Jess Franco in a number of his movies before that, no longer became the muse of Jess Franco. I'm going to read you this off the back of the Umbrella edition because it's pretty cool. Countess Nadine Karate is a sapphic vampiress with an insatiable thirst for female blood. Luring young women to her isolated island, she romances them and then kills them in ecstasy. Linda Westinghouse, played by Eva Stromberg, falls under the Countess's seductive spell only to discover a living nightmare she may never be able to escape. I think they mean lesbianism. This is style over substance, 100%. Yes, it has a lot of nudity. Starts out with a nightclub act with 2 unclad women kind of not quite dancing around. One of them strongly resembles the vampire countess. I don't really understand the point of the nightclub act except the titillation. But Linda and her boyfriend are watching this nightclub act. The boyfriend is a very marginal character in the movie and has a sleazy mustache. He reminds me of Eric Roberts in Star 80. But there are beautiful locations here. There's a lot of unclad female flesh in this. You also get Dennis Price turning up for no good reason, playing Dr. Seward, who is a psychiatrist at a mental asylum, who is treating one of the Countess's previous victims, which is a kind of side plot that doesn't go anywhere. None of the plots really go anywhere in this movie. But I don't think the target audience really cared. What it was about is beautiful locations, beautiful women. And for some reason, Jess Franco himself plays a character called Mehmet, who plays kind of a Renfield character as a side issue in one of the subplots. Jess Franco was a fine director of this kind of cinema, but as an actor, he had the charisma of a housebrick. Nonetheless, one of the great things about this is the soundtrack, which has been released on CD. And the soundtrack had a big renaissance later on in the early 21st century as the Vampyros Lesbos Sexadelic collection. The music is very lounge music-y, and it had a real big resurgence then, back when lounge music was really big around the turn of the century, when all of those ultra lounge collections were coming out, which I do have copies of. The soundtrack to this is a real banger and very of its time, but still a very groovy soundtrack. In fact, a lot of the soundtracks for these early Jess Franco movies and a whole bunch of other movies like Camille 2000 and those other Radley Metzger movies. You know, people like Piero Miliani doing the soundtracks and Piero Piccioni, and of course the maestro Ennio Morricone. There are a whole bunch of these exploitation film soundtracks that these guys did, which have music which is like there when the movies themselves are like here, going up to about there when there's a bit of nudity in them. Vampyros Lesbos, if you're into cult movies at all, and you are an aficionado of the oeuvre of Jess Franco, you're going to have a good time with this. It's not his best, but the soundtrack is just so cool. And unfortunately, you got Dennis Price, who, like George Sanders, showed up in these kinds of films at the end of his career. He was alcoholic, unfortunately. He'd lost a lot of his money basically being blackmailed by young men with whom he slept before it was legal for people to be gay. He was one of the people who was affected by that kind of blackmail in the early 1960s. Lost a lot of the money he made as a leading man in the 40s and 50s. And so ended up doing this kind of film, which is a bit sad. He was a good actor, but he wasn't necessarily the kind of actor who had a long-term career as a leading man. So I saw that and I watched it and I enjoyed it. But I'm probably more inclined to watch a couple of later Jess Franco movies like She Kills in Ecstasy or some of the women in prison ones next time I'm in the mood for a Jess Franco movie. This one moves a little slow and it moves a little bit. The plot is just not there. The locations are shot fantastically in and around Istanbul. And I think in Greece as well. Kind of enjoyed rewatching Vampyros Lesbos this weekend. This is the kind of movie that when I was 17 I would have loved, ignoring all of the flaws that I've already pointed out in the movie. Would have loved this. But now I'm just kind of nostalgically fond of it. Next up, I've got a Coen Brothers comedy. Now, Coen Brothers movies are a bit hit and miss for me. Some of them I love, some of them I'm not particularly fond of. And I'm more inclined to like the ones where they're comedies. And this one, which is a comedy about Hollywood in the early 1950s, is a lot of fun. And the more you know about classic Hollywood, the more fun it is. And it's Hail Caesar. Killer cast on this one. George Clooney, Josh Brolin, Alden Ehrenreich, Ralph Fiennes, Jonah Hill, Scarlett Johansson, Frances McDormand, Tilda Swinton, Channing Tatum, who gets the best musical number in the film. It's about a Hollywood studio in the early 1950s when communism was the moral panic of the time. And it's about a fixer for a Hollywood studio, a real-life guy called Eddie Mannix, who may or may not have killed George Reeves. But in the movie, this is a fictionalized version of Eddie Mannix working for a different studio, and he's troubleshooting all of the hassles in production. He's got a whole bunch of stars to deal with. There's Alden Ehrenreich playing a guy called Hobie Doyle, who's a singing cowboy star. You've got Scarlett Johansson playing an Esther Williams kind of woman who makes what they call aquatic pictures. You've got a big biblical epic, which is the big tentpole movie for the studio at the time, called Hail Caesar. And the star of that one is a guy called Baird Whitlock, played by George Clooney, who is an old school actor who had obviously been acting in the 30s and 40s and is coming towards the kind of peak and end of his career, much in the same mold as Robert Taylor. And he's in this big biblical epic as a Roman centurion who does the conversion to Jesus thing when he meets Jesus. He's there when Jesus is up on the cross. Baird Whitlock is as thick as a brick and gets kidnapped by a whole bunch of communist screenwriters in Hollywood for a ransom of $100,000. Meanwhile, you've got a singing and dancing star, Bert Gurney, played by Channing Tatum, who does a fantastic musical number called No Dames with a whole bunch of sailors in a bar, which has, let's just say, some homoerotic subtext to it, which is very funny. Now, Hobie Doyle, the singing cowboy star, gets roped into, and I use that almost literally, doing a witty, sophisticated comedy for a director called Lawrence Lorenz, played by Ralph Fiennes, and he is miscast to hell. His thing was riding a horse, singing cowboy songs, and shooting guns, and suddenly he's in a tuxedo in a drawing room comedy, and he just doesn't hack it. He can't do the dialogue, as this moment will show you.
Say your line exactly as I'm about to, just as I'm about to do.
Sure, okay.
Would that it were so simple.
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 My dear boy, why do you say that? Why do you say twere?
It's hilariously funny, and I love this movie a lot. You've got weird little cameos like Tilda Swinton playing identical twin gossip columnists who are rivals to one another. And you get Frances McDormand playing a film editor in one little moment she has with Josh Brolin. Josh Brolin's character I never warmed to in this movie because I know too much about the real Eddie Mannix. But the rest of it I love. It's such a loving pastiche of old classic Hollywood. Every actor knows exactly what kind of movie it is. Jonah Hill's in there playing a guy who's a legally bonded sap. So anything goes wrong in Hollywood, he takes the blame for it. so the stars get away with it. Scarlett Johansson does a water ballet scene, which is a lot of fun in the movie, and her character is a bit unsophisticated and also very, very fond of the cock. But Clooney does fantastically as Baird Whitlock, who, like I said, is as thick as a brick and is easily swayed by whoever is nearest to him at the moment. That's a quality with which we're all familiar now. I totally love Hail Caesar. It'd be interesting to take this movie back in time and show it to somebody who knew Hollywood in the 1950s, and just see what they think of it. The Coen Brothers have a great time with this movie. And all the people I know who are really big on movies, and some of the movie critics I know, love Hail Caesar because of that knowledge and that kind of knowingness of knowing that Scarlett Johansson is playing Esther Williams and knowing that Clooney is playing Robert Taylor, and knowing that Channing Tatum's playing a twisted version of Gene Kelly. All of that really works in this movie. Every now and then I can watch it and just love it all over again. So much fun. And even though it didn't hit with an audience particularly, the audience it's hitting with are people who know Hollywood really well. And that, for all my sins, includes me. Lastly, we've got a movie directed by Sidney Pollack in 1969. A World War II movie which is unique. It's weird, it's surrealistic, it's fantastical, it's odd, it's Castle Keep. Starring Burt Lancaster, Patrick O'Neill's in there as well as Jean-Pierre Aumont plays the count who owns a castle, which is on one of the crucial junctions on the road to the Ardennes during World War II. And the armies from both sides are about to attack it. Also has some interesting character actors like Scott Wilson, Al Freeman Jr. Bruce Dern turns up as a religious and a conscientious objector who is so pissed off with the war he becomes a religious nut and ends up with a small cult following him around the war. Best of all, Peter Falk, playing Sergeant Rossi, one of the soldiers, is also a baker, and his character is my favourite in this movie. The blurb says, a 10th century castle, a 20th century war, and the outspoken novel comes to life on the screen. Now, everything I've heard about the novel compared to the movie says the movie is better than the novel, and I like the movie. It's a tone poem almost. Really weird. Major Falconer, played by Burt Lancaster, with an eye patch, and a small group of soldiers he has who are all shell-shocked and wounded, have been wounded in the war. And you can make the argument that they're actually ghosts. That argument you'd have to justify. Though there is a scene with Patrick O'Neill's character backlit by a stained glass window, where you can see the stained glass window through his character. Now, it may just be a glitch of the reflections of the camera lens, or it could be a deliberate choice, who knows? Falconer and his soldiers end up at this castle where the old count, played by Jean-Pierre Aumont, wants his wife knocked up so that his line can continue. The castle is full of priceless works of art. He is trying to preserve the castle and those works of art, and also his lineage, because he's impotent. That person turns out to be Falconer, because the star always gets the woman. The soldiers and Falconer use the castle as a base. The soldiers themselves go into the local town and find a brothel full of incredibly attractive women. But Sergeant Rossi, played by Peter Falk, goes across the road to the boulangerie and says to the guys, I used to be a baker. This is a bakery. And when there's a bakery, there's a baker's wife. And he shakes up with the baker's wife because the baker's nicked off. And he starts baking bread because he doesn't want to do the war anymore. He wants to bake bread and sleep with the very attractive wife of a baker who is no longer there. And so he gets an interesting arc there as well. This movie is surrealistic. All of the characters are very different. You've got the professional soldier played by Burt Lancaster. You've got Patrick O'Neill's character, who is an art historian before the war and wants to preserve all of this beautiful art that's in the castle. And that's his main focus. He also lusts after the Countess, but very unsuccessfully. Al Freeman Jr.'s character, who's the only black person in the group, and his race is never explicitly mentioned in the film. It's very colourblind casting. Wants to be a writer. There's a couple of other minor characters in there as well. But a very diverse group of people. And all of them get their moment to outline who their character is. Meanwhile, the Germans are turning up. There's a scouting patrol that Falconer takes out from a gazebo. One of the soldiers finds a Volkswagen and falls in love with it and wants to preserve the Volkswagen. And then the war hits, the town gets invaded by the Germans, and all hell breaks loose. There's so much to love in this movie. The characters are all quirky and interesting. Not in the same over-the-top way that the characters in Kelly's Heroes are over-the-top and interesting, or the characters in The Dirty Dozen, but in a much more meditative kind of way. There are great moments, and every line in the movie is choice and priceless and great. I can't recall another movie where every line is so cool as it is in this film. And there are scenes with the battles which are amusing, where the American soldiers take over a German tank, which is inside a church. It's barged its way to a church. They can't really drive it right, and they end up destroying the church, trying to get the tank out of the church. And there's another scene where a brothel full of sex workers takes out a German tank with Courvoisier bottles full of petrol as Molotov cocktails. From the balcony of the brothel, they just lob them at this German tank as it goes past, because the Germans have all been waving at the sex workers, who are waving bottles that look like they're full of booze, but are actually Molotov cocktails. I like that. I like the fact that they're not just treated as dolly birds. They're given a little bit of agency and a little bit of a something to do in the war. Castle Keep is a weird film. Had a lot of trouble making it too, because they started out in snowing because the movie set in winter, and they filmed some of the thing. They made an enormous 3-sided set to be the castle. And so they go away for the weekend, come back, the set's burned down for some reason. Burnt down to ashes on the ground. So they've got to go shoot other scenes with interiors somewhere else, while the production builds the front facade of the castle again. Meanwhile, it stops snowing and spring's arrived, so they've got to cover all of the landscape with powdered marble imported from Italy to make it look like snow. And everybody is getting scratchy eyes from all of this marble dust in the air. Lots of problems making this film, but I like what they did with it. It's a World War II movie, which you can argue is either pro-war or anti-war, but is very much in favour of the characters in the movie. And you could argue that all of the characters are dead and are resurrected as ghosts. There is some dialogue at the start as a voiceover which says that everybody in this group has died during the war before, but it could be just a poetic and metaphorical thing for this character to say at the start. You can argue endlessly about the nature of this film, but I enjoy it every time I watch it. This is the indicator version of it, and this one is multi-region. Came out a few years ago, and they got it very cheaply on a sale. But it's one of those movies that stays with you and haunts you a little bit. You start thinking about what the hell went on in this film, and what the hell is the meaning of the film. And you can argue 50 different ways, and none of them's not valid. Castle Keep is a movie I really enjoy. By the way, I'm going to post links to where you can get these 3 films in the description of this video, so you can click on the Amazon link if you want to get it on Blu-ray, and I'll get a little bump from that if you liked it. So that's what I got for you this time around. 3 weird and wonderful movies, each one very different, each one entertaining in its own way. Jess Franco, you got the Coen Brothers, got Sidney Pollock, and that's a good weekend's viewing for me. And I'm happy that I picked these ones to watch. They totally satisfied me as movies. And I'll be thinking about them for days after watching them, which is good value for me. So thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and tell me what you think of these 3. Is that the right way up? I got it the right way up. A lot of fun, very different films. Not everyone's going to be to everyone's taste, but then which movies are? Next up, we've got the midweek video, and I'm looking forward to that because I don't even know what I'm doing yet. And then we get back to Science Fiction Saturday once more. It's going to be a good year for movies, and a good year for rewatching movies that I like. So until I do all that stuff and we get back on the merry-go-round, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some really freaky movies. And I'll catch you next time.